Forgotten Companion. Chapter 1. A Woman Without Position. It was a peculiar kind of existence, to be present in every room and yet spoken of in none. Miss Ruth Calder had learned long ago the art of being necessary without being noticed. In the household of Lady Everley, she was neither servant nor relation. She occupied the ambiguous space reserved for companions, useful, discreet, and in the eyes of society, comfortably forgettable. She was addressed politely, thanked sparingly, and discussed never. Such women were meant to soften loneliness, to read aloud when eyes failed, to remember birthdays and names and small social obligations that slipped from more important minds. They were not meant to listen closely when gentlemen spoke of governance, nor to remember what they heard. Ruth did both. At Lady Everley's London drawing-room, forgettability was considered a virtue in someone like her. The room itself was an elegant thing. High ceilings, pale silk walls, furniture polished to quiet gleam. Gentlemen gathered there to debate the price of corn, the restless temper of the nation, and the lingering consequences of wars that had reshaped Europe and unsettled England's sense of itself. They did not trouble themselves with the woman who poured tea or adjusted shawls. They saw Lady Everley's diamonds and her connections. They saw the clergyman's earnest brow, the banker's cautious hands. Ruth was simply the quiet figure by the wall, hands folded, posture perfect, watching. That evening, the drawing-room thrummed with fashionable concern. The air smelled of beeswax, orange peel, and wool warmed by bodies and conversation. A late frost had sharpened the mood of the city. It crept into speech, into the way men discussed bread prices and pamphlets passed too eagerly from hand to hand. Lady Everley sat regally upon the sofa, her manner pleasant and her smile trained by long practice. She had outlived 2 husbands and several governments and possessed the rare skill of appearing indulgent while missing nothing. Ruth stood behind her chair, as she always did, ready to anticipate needs. Yet her mind never idled. She listened as others might read a newspaper, attending not only to words, but to what the words concealed. "The proposal will not pass," Mr. Halford declared, his voice smooth as oiled wood. "The Commons are noisy, but they are not fools. Any measure that meddles with the press will meet resistance." "A measure to protect the realm is not meddling," another gentleman replied. "It is meddling," Halford returned, smiling faintly, "and it will make martyrs." Ruth noted how he said martyrs, as though he were tasting it, weighing its usefulness. Lady Everley, who had learned long ago how to interrupt without appearing to do so, lifted her brows. "Surely, Mr. Halford, you do not suggest we leave sedition unchallenged?" "I suggest, my lady," Halford replied smoothly, "that we challenge it intelligently." There was a murmur of approval. A gentleman shifted closer to the fireplace, warming his hands. Another sipped claret with a thoughtful frown. Ruth saw the way Halford's fingers tightened around his glass when Sir Jonathan Pierce was mentioned, not enough to be remarked upon, but enough to matter. Sir Jonathan arrived late. The footman's announcement carried through the hall, soft but unmistakable. Lady Everley's attention sharpened at once. The room made space, subtle, instinctive, as though the air itself yielded to the arrival of a man considered important. Sir Jonathan Pierce entered with the controlled ease of someone accustomed to being observed. He was not particularly handsome in the youthful, ornamental way that pleased débutantes, but his face carried purpose. The strong line of his mouth, the careful composure of his gaze. Ambition had carved itself into him as surely as time. Ruth watched him as he greeted Lady Everley, correctly deferential, yet not fawning, and then moved among the gentlemen, offering quiet remarks that made them lean closer, as though their own thoughts had grown suddenly dull beside his. Halford's smile never wavered, but Ruth saw the moment his eyes narrowed. When Sir Jonathan reached the table where a small pile of correspondence lay, notes Lady Everley had received that day, he paused, as if some unspoken question had struck him. Later, when he sat for supper, his hand hovered above a folded paper near his plate. Ruth's attention tightened. The note had not been there at the start of the meal. Conversation flowed. Someone spoke of unrest in the north. Someone else dismissed it as exaggeration. Lady Everleigh laughed politely. Yet Sir Jonathan sat very still, his fingers suspended above that folded slip, as though it might burn him. Ruth moved behind Lady Everleigh, ostensibly to adjust the older woman's shawl. In doing so, she saw the seal. It was not Lady Everleigh's. It was not Sir Jonathan's either. The wax was cheap, pressed hastily, marked not by a crest, but by the impression of a common coin. A trick meant to disguise identity. Ruth felt something cold gather behind her ribs. She had seen such seals before, during the last election season, when Lady Everleigh had received anonymous threats delivered with similar careless cleverness. Sir Jonathan's eyes flicked up briefly and met Ruth's. For the first time that evening, he looked at her as though she were not furniture. There was a question in his gaze. Ruth, careful as breathing, let her eyes drop, not to the note, but to his left hand. The thumb bore a faint stain of ink. He had been writing earlier, perhaps. Perhaps he would assume the note a reply from someone in his own circle. So Ruth made the smallest possible movement. She shifted Lady Everleigh's wineglass a fraction, just enough to draw attention to the note without exposing it openly. Her body shielded the table for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat she let her fingers brush the edge of the folded paper, just enough to confirm its weight, its thickness, more than one sheet. Sir Jonathan's hand tightened. He did not pick it up, but when the course ended, he slipped the note quietly into his pocket. Ruth returned to her place, her face calm, her mind sharpened. Halford watched Sir Jonathan across the table, his expression thoughtful. Too thoughtful. Ruth understood then. This was not merely gossip. Something was moving beneath the surface of the room, something that required a quiet woman by the wall to notice it first. And she, who had spent her life unnoticed, had just been seen. Chapter 2. Influence Unacknowledged. The morning after Sir Jonathan Pierce's visit dawned pale and reluctant, as though London itself were uncertain how much light to permit the day. Ruth rose early, as was her habit, and went directly to the small writing table Lady Everleigh had allowed her to claim as her own. It stood near the tall windows of the morning room, where daylight entered without drama and left no place for shadows to hide. She preferred it so. Candlelight flattered illusion, daylight demanded precision. She had barely settled with her papers when Lady Everleigh appeared at the threshold, wrapped in a loose morning robe, her silver hair unpinned. "You look as though you have already been awake an hour," Lady Everleigh observed. "I have," Ruth replied. "There were letters to review." Lady Everleigh crossed the room slowly and seated herself opposite. "Sir Jonathan will call again today." Ruth did not look up. "Did he say why?" "He rarely says why," Lady Everleigh replied, "only that he must." Ruth's pen paused briefly, then continued its neat line. She had expected as much. Men like Sir Jonathan did not abandon puzzles once they had glimpsed their solution. When he arrived later that morning, the city beyond the windows already hummed with motion. Carriages rattled over damp stone. Vendors called to one another in the street below. The world moved on, indifferent to the quiet negotiations that shaped it. Sir Jonathan was shown into the morning room without ceremony. He did not remove his gloves at once, which Ruth noted. It was a small sign of tension, a man unprepared to linger. Lady Everleigh gestured him to a chair. "You wish to speak further?" "I did," Sir Jonathan replied, his gaze flicking briefly, only briefly, toward Ruth, before returning to Lady Everleigh. "I regret intruding upon your household so early." "Nonsense," Lady Everleigh said lightly. "Intrusion requires surprise. You are expected." Ruth felt the faintest tightening in her chest at the word. Sir Jonathan drew out a sheaf of papers and laid them upon the desk. I have reviewed the note again, and I have considered Miss Calder's observations. Ruth's pen stilled. Lady Everleigh's expression gave nothing away. Sir Jonathan hesitated, then turned toward Ruth fully. If I may speak plainly, Miss Calder, your analysis was not merely astute, it was accurate. Since last night I have discovered evidence that confirms your suspicion. The accusation is not meant to destroy me outright, it is meant to restrain me. Ruth inclined her head slightly. That is often the more efficient method. Sir Jonathan studied her. How long have you understood politics in this way? Ruth considered the question. Long enough to know that power rarely announces itself honestly. Lady Everleigh smiled faintly. Ruth has always had a talent for noticing what others overlook. Sir Jonathan removed his gloves at last. Then I will not overlook it. The words settled into the room with quiet weight. He spread out his papers, drafts of legislation, margin notes, correspondence from members of Parliament whose loyalty was flexible at best. Ruth recognized several names. Some were sincere, others were ambitious, a few were dangerous. This bill, Sir Jonathan said, tapping one page, is necessary, not popular, but necessary. Public assemblies have grown increasingly volatile. Pamphleteers stir unrest with half-truths, and the Crown grows nervous. And nervous governments overreach, Ruth said calmly. Sir Jonathan's mouth curved faintly. Precisely. Lady Everleigh leaned back. So the question is not whether to act, but how. Ruth's eyes moved over the pages. The language is too broad, she said after a moment. It invites misinterpretation and exploitation. Sir Jonathan exhaled slowly. I have said as much, but the Cabinet wishes for sweeping authority. And Halford wishes for you to bear the blame for it, Ruth added quietly. Sir Jonathan's gaze sharpened. Yes. Silence fell, thoughtful, not awkward. Ruth felt acutely the unusual nature of the moment. A gentleman of influence listening to a woman who, by all accounts, should have been invisible. You must narrow the language, Ruth continued. Define the threat precisely. Remove ambiguity. Those who fear tyranny will have less ground to stand upon. And those who profit from outrage will find it harder to manufacture, Lady Everleigh added. Sir Jonathan nodded slowly. But that will anger powerful men. It already does, Ruth said. The difference is whether they can claim moral outrage or only personal inconvenience. Sir Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. You speak as though you have drafted legislation yourself. I have read enough of it, Ruth replied evenly, to understand how it fails. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Then perhaps you will read more. From that morning onward, an unspoken arrangement took shape. Sir Jonathan continued to visit Lady Everleigh under the pretence of consultation. Yet increasingly, it was Ruth who read aloud, Ruth who annotated drafts, Ruth who traced patterns in opposition speeches and identified which arguments were genuine and which were merely rehearsed. She did not tell Sir Jonathan what to do. She never framed her insights as commands. She spoke of consequences, of likely responses, of how men behaved when cornered. Sir Jonathan listened. It unsettled him more than open disagreement ever had. You have an uncommon ability, he remarked one afternoon, watching her mark a passage with her quill. You speak without seeking credit. Ruth did not look up. Credit is dangerous. Influence without acknowledgement is more so, he countered. Ruth's hand paused, only if discovered. His gaze lingered on her. Everything of value is eventually discovered. The words stayed with her long after he left. With influence came attention. Not the open sort, no one addressed Ruth directly, no one invited her opinion at table, but the subtle shift of awareness. Conversations ceased when she entered a room. Eyes lingered a moment too long. Halford, in particular, had begun to watch her with open curiosity, masked as politeness. One evening, as Ruth crossed the hall carrying correspondence for Sir Jonathan, Halford stepped aside to let her pass. "Miss Calder," he said pleasantly, "how diligent you are." Ruth inclined her head. "Good evening, sir." Halford's gaze slid to the papers in her arms. "Lady Everley keeps a most capable companion." "My lady is generous," Ruth replied. "Generous indeed," Halford said softly. "One might almost imagine you are her secretary." Ruth met his gaze steadily. "I am whatever my lady requires." Halford's smile sharpened. "And what does Sir Jonathan require of you?" The question was not loud. It did not need to be. It was a test. Ruth felt the familiar instinct to retreat, but she had learned, through bitter experience, that retreat sometimes invited pursuit. "He requires nothing of me," she said calmly. "Sir Jonathan is quite capable of managing his own affairs." Halford inclined his head, though his eyes were cold. "Invisible women often believe themselves safe," he murmured, "but when they step into the light—" He let the sentence trail off and moved away. Ruth stood still for a moment after he had gone, her pulse steady but quickened. She understood the warning. Halford had noticed her, and men like Halford did not ignore threats. That night, Lady Everley summoned Ruth to her private sitting room. "You are being observed," Lady Everley said without preamble. Ruth folded her hands. "I am aware. And I will be careful." Lady Everley's gaze softened. "Careful may no longer be enough. If Halford believes you influence Sir Jonathan, he will attempt to use you." "Or destroy me," Ruth said quietly. "Yes," Lady Everley agreed. "That too." Ruth felt the weight of choice settle upon her. She had lived her life in the margins by design. Visibility was not merely uncomfortable, it was perilous. Yet she could not pretend she wished to retreat entirely. Sir Jonathan's trust had altered something within her. Not pride, she was too disciplined for that, but purpose. She had seen how ideas shaped policy, how policy shaped lives. To withdraw now felt like abandonment. Still, she understood limits. The next day, when Sir Jonathan called, Ruth offered only brief responses. She read when asked, but did not elaborate. She corrected nothing unless directly questioned. Sir Jonathan noticed at once. After Lady Everley excused herself, he turned to Ruth, his expression intent. "You are withdrawing." Ruth met his gaze calmly. "I am returning to my proper role." "Your proper role?" His voice was sharp now. "Who decided that?" Ruth's hands remained steady. "Society." Sir Jonathan stepped closer. "Society is not always correct." Ruth's breath caught. "Society is powerful." "And so are you," he said quietly. The words struck her harder than she expected. "I do not wish to place you at risk," she said after a moment, "nor myself." Sir Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Risk is unavoidable. The question is whether it is borne honestly." Ruth looked at him then, really looked, and saw the cost of his ambition etched into his posture, his restraint. She understood that he stood at a crossroads not unlike her own. "I will assist," she said softly, "but I will not be seen to do so." Sir Jonathan held her gaze. "For now." Ruth did not answer. She knew the truth of what he implied. Invisibility could not be sustained forever, not when power had already begun to notice her absence. Chapter 3. The Weight of Visibility. Visibility, Ruth discovered, did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived as pressure. It pressed in small ways at first, an unexpected pause in conversation when she entered a room, a glance that lingered half a second too long, a polite inquiry that concealed calculation. Ruth had spent years unnoticed. She recognized the shift instantly. To be observed was not the same as being acknowledged. Observation carried scrutiny, and scrutiny carried threat. Halford's interest sharpened. It was not expressed openly. He did not confront her again, nor did he attempt the easy intimidation of rumor or raised voice. Instead, he watched. He positioned himself near Sir Jonathan at gatherings. He lingered near Lady Everleigh's household when he knew Sir Jonathan would be present. And always, when his gaze slid toward Ruth, it carried a question rather than an accusation. "Who are you? What are you doing here? Whose side are you on?" Ruth answered none of it aloud, but she felt the pressure all the same. The warning came, as warnings often did, from Lady Everleigh. "You must step back," Lady Everleigh said one evening, seated by the fire in her private sitting room. "Halford believes you are shaping Sir Jonathan's course." Ruth stood opposite her, hands clasped. "I am advising him." Lady Everleigh's eyes softened. "Which is precisely the problem." Ruth said nothing. The fire snapped softly, sending sparks briefly upward. Shadows danced across the walls. "You understand the rules," Lady Everleigh continued. "Men of ambition may accept counsel from unexpected quarters, but only so long as it remains unseen. Once influence acquires a face, it becomes a liability." Ruth nodded. She had known this since girlhood. She had lived by it. "And yet," Lady Everleigh said, studying her closely, "you have not withdrawn." Ruth's voice was steady. "Not entirely." Lady Everleigh leaned back. "Then you must decide what you are willing to lose." The question followed Ruth long after she left the room. She attempted, at first, a careful retreat. She answered Sir Jonathan's questions briefly. She refrained from offering unsolicited observation. She returned to the safer rhythms of service, organizing correspondence, arranging schedules, attending Lady Everleigh rather than shaping policy. Sir Jonathan noticed immediately. "You are not yourself," he said one afternoon, when Lady Everleigh had left them alone under the pretense of rest. Ruth kept her eyes on the papers she was sorting. "I am precisely myself. You have gone quiet." "I was always quiet." Sir Jonathan's mouth tightened. "Do not hide behind habit." Ruth looked up then. "And do not pretend ignorance. You know why this is necessary." Sir Jonathan's gaze hardened. "Because Halford disapproves?" "Because Halford calculates," Ruth replied. "And calculation destroys what it cannot control." Silence stretched between them, taut and brittle. "I will not be blackmailed into silence," Sir Jonathan said finally. Ruth's heart tightened. "This is not about you." He stepped closer. "It is always about me. That is the nature of politics." Ruth met his gaze, her voice quiet but firm. "No, it is about the woman whose reputation can be destroyed without consequence. It is about the companion no one will defend once she is named." Sir Jonathan flinched, only slightly, but enough. "You would be defended," he said. "By whom?" Ruth asked softly. "You. For how long?" The truth hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Sir Jonathan turned away. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I did not intend to place you in danger." "I know," Ruth replied, "which is why I must step back." He faced her again, frustration sharp in his eyes. "And leave me to Halford's designs." "You are not without allies," Ruth said, "nor without skill." "And yet," he said bitterly, "I have come to rely upon you." The admission unsettled them both. That evening, Halford made his move. It was done obliquely, as all effective threats were. A pamphlet appeared, not naming Sir Jonathan, not accusing him directly, but questioning the integrity of recent legislative proposals. It spoke vaguely of outside influence and unaccountable advisors. It hinted at manipulation without offering proof. Ruth read it once and knew precisely whom it was meant to frighten. By the next morning, Lady Everley received 3 visitors, all under the guise of social calls, each carefully curious about Ruth's role in the household. Lady Everley dismissed them politely, but her jaw was set. "They are testing the ground," she said afterward, "seeing whether your presence is worth attacking openly." Ruth folded the pamphlet neatly. "Then I must remove myself from the ground entirely." Lady Everley regarded her closely. "You will not be erased so easily." Ruth's mouth curved faintly. "I have been erased before." She withdrew completely the following day. Sir Jonathan was told she was indisposed. The day after, that she was attending Lady Everley's affairs elsewhere. By the 3rd day, she was no longer mentioned at all. The effect on Sir Jonathan was immediate and damaging. Without Ruth's steady analysis, he found himself reacting rather than anticipating. He misjudged a committee vote. He underestimated the ferocity of opposition from a faction he had believed placated. Halford's influence grew visibly stronger, his tone confident, his alliances reinforced. Sir Jonathan knew with growing certainty that silence was costing him more than candour ever could. When he finally confronted Ruth, it was not in the drawing room, nor in Lady Everley's presence, but in the quiet morning room, where pale daylight stripped away pretense. "You cannot continue like this," he said. Ruth stood by the window, hands folded. "Nor can you." He moved closer. "You are punishing us both." "I am protecting us," she replied. "By disappearing?" "Yes." His voice tightened. "I need you." Ruth closed her eyes briefly. The words struck deeper than she had prepared for. "You need my mind," she said carefully. "I need your judgment," he corrected. "And your honesty." Ruth turned to face him then, her expression composed but pale. "And what will you do when your allies discover that judgment comes from a woman with no title, no fortune, no protection?" Sir Jonathan did not hesitate. "I will acknowledge it." The certainty in his tone frightened her more than his anger ever had. "That would ruin me," she said. He stepped closer. "I will not allow—" "You cannot prevent it," Ruth interrupted quietly. "You cannot stand between me and the consequences of visibility. I have lived my life understanding that." Sir Jonathan searched her face. "And I have lived mine believing influence should answer to merit." Ruth's throat tightened. "Merit does not shield women." Silence fell, heavy and aching. That night, the 2nd pamphlet appeared. This one was sharper. It named Sir Jonathan indirectly, linking his proposals to domestic manipulation and private counsel unbecoming of public trust. It stopped just short of naming Ruth, but the implication was unmistakable. Halford had drawn blood. Lady Everley summoned Ruth immediately. "You must leave London," Lady Everley said without preamble. "At least for a time." Ruth stiffened. "I will not flee." "This is not flight," Lady Everley replied. "It is strategy. Halford wants reaction. Deny him that." Ruth's hands clenched. "And Sir Jonathan?" Lady Everley's gaze was gentle. "He must choose." The choice came sooner than expected. The following morning, Sir Jonathan received an offer, quiet, conditional, and unmistakable. Support from a powerful bloc within the Commons, protection from scandal, advancement assured. The price was simple. He must distance himself from unofficial advisers. He must publicly reaffirm his independence. And he must accept a politically advantageous marriage already discreetly proposed. Sir Jonathan read the terms once, then again. Then he folded the letter carefully and burned it. When he arrived at Lady Everley's house that evening, His expression was resolute. Ruth stood near the window, the city dim beyond the glass. "They have offered me everything," he said quietly. Ruth did not turn. "And demanded what?" "Your erasure." She closed her eyes. "Then you must accept." Sir Jonathan crossed the room in 3 strides. "I will not." She turned sharply. "You must not be ruined for my sake." His voice was low and fierce. "You are not my weakness. You are the proof of my integrity." Ruth's breath caught. Integrity does not survive politics. "Then politics must be made to answer to it," he said. She searched his face, this man who stood at the height of ambition and chose risk instead of convenience. "You will lose," she whispered. "Perhaps," he replied, "but I will not lose myself." Ruth felt the final barrier inside her give way, not to romance, but to truth. "Then," she said quietly, "you must be prepared to expose everything." Sir Jonathan nodded once. "Tomorrow." They stood together in silence, the weight of consequence pressing in from all sides. Neither of them spoke of love. They did not need to. What bound them now was far more dangerous. Chapter 4. No longer forgotten. They moved through London as shadows move, quietly, deliberately, without calling attention to themselves. Lady Everleigh's carriage did not take them to any place of society. Instead, it turned away from well-lit squares and into narrower streets where the city's true business was conducted. Here, printers laboured late into the night, clerks drank away their discretion, and information changed hands without ceremony. Ruth sat opposite Sir Jonathan inside the carriage, her hands folded, her posture composed. Only the steady rise and fall of her breath betrayed the intensity of her focus. "You are certain?" Sir Jonathan asked quietly. "As one can be," Ruth replied. "Halford's scheme relies on speed and implication. If we are to counter it, we must be quicker and precise." The carriage stopped before a modest building above a print shop. The smell of ink and damp paper clung to the air. The editor who received them looked unsurprised and profoundly unhappy. "You will ruin me," he said without greeting. "You are already ruined," Sir Jonathan replied evenly. "Halford has merely delayed the moment." The man's hands shook as he gestured them inside. "He said it would sell. He said the public demanded exposure." Ruth stepped forward then, not assertively, but calmly, as she always did when she wished to be heard. "Who delivered the documents to you?" she asked. The editor hesitated, his gaze flicking to Sir Jonathan, then back to Ruth. Something in her composure, her lack of accusation, unsettled him more than authority could have. "A clerk," he said at last. "Northern accounts. He claimed to have proof." Ruth inclined her head. "And the papers?" The editor produced a folder from beneath his desk. They looked convincing. They were. The handwriting was careful, the sums were plausible, names of widows, villages, and charities were real. Ruth felt the cold precision of the forgery immediately. "These are altered," she said quietly. Sir Jonathan frowned. "How can you tell?" Ruth pointed to a marginal notation. "This mark. It is a printer's instruction, but outdated. No one uses it now except a particular accounting office near Whitehall." The editor stared. "You notice that?" "I notice patterns," Ruth replied simply. Lady Everleigh's network did the rest. By dawn, they had a name. By mid-morning, Sir Jonathan confronted the clerk privately, armed with evidence and the promise of protection. The confession came swiftly. Halford had paid for the forgery, but he had not acted alone. A cabinet member, one Sir Jonathan had once trusted, had sanctioned the attack. Not to destroy Sir Jonathan entirely, but to curb him. to remind him that ambition must remain obedient. Sir Jonathan's influence had grown too independent, and Ruth's counsel had made him dangerous. When Sir Jonathan arrived at the formal gathering that afternoon, the air was already electric with rumour. Gentlemen clustered together, voices low, expressions guarded. Halford sat near the front, his manner impeccable, his confidence unmistakable. Ruth sat near the back beside Lady Everley. She felt the weight of the room press upon her, not fear, but inevitability. Sir Jonathan stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatise. He spoke as Ruth had always advised him to speak, plainly, precisely, without indulgence. He named the accusation before it could be printed. He produced the altered documents. He presented the clerk's confession. He named Halford. The silence that followed was absolute. Halford's smile faltered, only briefly but enough. And then Sir Jonathan did something Ruth had not expected. "Miss Ruth Calder," he said, clearly and without apology. Ruth's breath stilled. "She observed the first sign of this scheme," Sir Jonathan continued. "She read what others dismissed. She reasoned where others merely reacted. It is due to her counsel that I stand here with truth rather than rumour." The room held its breath. Ruth felt every gaze turn upon her. Disbelief, curiosity, disdain, respect. She had lived long enough invisible to recognise the moment she crossed the boundary into permanence. Sir Jonathan's gaze found hers briefly. In it was apology and resolve. Halford rose slowly. "You would place the direction of the nation in the hands of a woman without position?" he asked smoothly. Sir Jonathan did not flinch. "I would place it in the hands of those who think clearly and act honestly." Halford's smile hardened. "Then you will find yourself very alone." "Then," Sir Jonathan replied calmly, "I will be honestly so." The gathering dissolved in murmurs and calculation. Alliances shifted silently. Nothing was decided at once, but everything had changed. Later, in the corridor beyond the hall, Halford approached Ruth. "You have made yourself visible," he said softly. "Do you imagine men like me forgive that?" Ruth met his gaze steadily. "Men like you do not forgive anything. That is why the nation must be protected from you." Halford's expression sharpened, then cooled. He offered a brief bow and walked away, already planning his survival. That evening, Lady Everley's drawing room was quiet. Sir Jonathan stood near the fire, his posture uncharacteristically uncertain. Ruth entered softly, intending to pass through unnoticed. "You should not have been named," she said first. "It was dangerous." "It was necessary," he replied. "I will not use your mind and then deny your existence." Ruth's throat tightened. "Your career, your ambitions." "My ambitions are not worth building upon cowardice," he said. "Ruth, you steady what others inflame. I rely upon you, not as a convenience, but as an equal." Ruth looked at him then. This man who had chosen exposure over safety. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "I want you beside me," he said, "not as a shadow, not as a tool, as a partner." Ruth exhaled slowly. "Society will not allow it." Sir Jonathan's mouth tightened. "Then society must endure it." She searched his face. "And when it costs you advancement?" "Then I will advance differently." Ruth felt something loosen inside her, something she had held tight all her life. "I will not be ornamental," she said. "I will not be praised and then ignored." Sir Jonathan met her gaze steadily. "I would never ask it." The wedding was simple, no spectacle, no triumph. Ruth wore a modest gown. Sir Jonathan stood beside her with quiet certainty. Lady Everley watched from the front pew, satisfaction softening her composed expression. Ruth did not feel rescued. She felt recognized. In the months that followed, London whispered. Sir Jonathan's ascent slowed, but his influence deepened. His speeches grew quieter, sharper, impossible to dismiss. Men complained he anticipated their objections before they spoke them. They never spoke Ruth's name, not publicly, not often. But she no longer required permission to exist. At twilight, lamplight glowed from the windows of their house. Inside, silhouettes bent together over a desk, papers spread, hands pointing, voices low. Quiet power, lasting partnership, influence enduring. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap